Hey, what's up guys, and happy Halloween. I hope that you guys are having a fun and safe holiday. Now, today for my Halloween special, I wanted to do a video that is more or less a response to a video that I made a few months ago where I listed my top 10 favorite vampire films. I really enjoyed making that, and you guys seem to have enjoyed it yourselves, so today I'm going to be listing my top 10 favorite werewolf films. Now, before I begin, I just want to say that this is just my list, so some of your favorite werewolf films may or may not be on this list, but either way, I just wanted to say, guys, I'm very interested to know what your favorite werewolf films are, so be sure to post them down in the comments below. One more thing, I just want to list that I'm, for the most part, going to be listing just strictly werewolf films. I'm going to try to avoid werewolf films where they interact with other creatures like vampires and such, so you may not see movies like Van Helsing or Monster Squad on here, but there are a couple of exceptions, and I will explain why. One last thing before I get started, guys, I wanted to say that this is not a ranking video. These films are not ranked in any particular order, so they're not from greatest to least or least to greatest and so on. But with that said, guys, let's do this. So coming up first, I'm going to, of course, start out with one of the most iconic werewolf films ever made, and that is The Wolfman from 1941, starring Lon Chaney Jr. Guys, not only was this a great werewolf film, but it was the start of a great werewolf story in general, as this would only be the start of Lawrence Talbot's tragic and cursed life as a werewolf. Lon Chaney Jr. really sold his performance. It was very sympathetic and tragic, and not only was his performance as Talbot good, his performance as the Wolfman was really good. He really delivered on the movements and mannerisms of a werewolf, and on that note, this is by far my favorite werewolf design. If you're in the mood for a great werewolf movie, then it would be criminal for me not to include this on my list. So coming up next is Frankenstein meets the Wolfman from 1943, the sequel to the Wolfman. Now again, guys, I know I said I would mostly avoid films like this, but I also said that there were some exceptions. And this is indeed an exception because while, yes, the Frankenstein monster does appear in this movie, he's not the main focus. He's more of a plot device. This story is more of a werewolf film as it mostly revolves around a resurrected Lawrence Talbot seeking a cure for his curse, and he believes Dr. Frankenstein is the key to his peace. But of course, the journey doesn't work out for him at all, and it leads him to a battle with a Frankenstein monster. Not only is this a great werewolf film, but it's also famous for being the film that started the idea of a shared universe where characters from different stories meet and interact with one another, which leads to two sequels where we get the same concept, such as House of Frankenstein and House of Dracula. Not only is this one of my favorite werewolf films, this is actually one of my favorite films of all time, so of course I definitely had to include it in this list. So coming up next is Bad Moon from 1996, a film where the protection for man against a werewolf is man's best friend itself. The movie is enjoyable and the design of the werewolf was pretty good and very imposing. I think the concept that any moon can trigger a werewolf transformation that was heavily implied in the film was pretty interesting and added some suspense. But on the other hand, I'm more of a traditionalist. I like the idea that only a full moon can trigger a werewolf transformation. But at the same time, again, it is very intriguing. The story was decent and the effects were very good, and as well as the werewolf design. Now, I wouldn't necessarily put this high on my list if I was going to rank them or recommend them to others if they want a good werewolf film, but nonetheless, it's a good movie and is definitely worth checking out if you're a fan of werewolves. Alright guys, so moving on next, we have Underworld: Rise of the Lycans. Again, this is another exception as we see werewolves and vampires interacting in this film, but despite that, this is definitely more of a werewolf story because we see a group of Lycans who are forced to do the bidding of vampires, and one of them, Lucian, falls in love with a vampire lord's daughter, Sonia, creating more or less a Romeo and Juliet concept that, of course, ends in tragedy, forcing Lucian to start a revolution with the other Lycans. Now, I think this is a pretty decent werewolf story, and I like the design of the werewolves, and I think it blends into the first two Underworld films very well, so Of course, this is for sure going on my list. All right, so next up is Teen Wolf from 1985. I was a big fan of Michael J. Fox movies growing up, so of course I had to jump on the opportunity to watch a werewolf film starring him. Now, I'm not a fan of this concept, but this film was my introduction into the idea of talking werewolves. And again, I prefer when they're more savage monsters, but I learned to let that go for this film. And there's also other non-traditional elements, such as the werewolf being able to change at will or out of anger or any time of the day. And I also remember this film also teaching the same lesson from Spider-Man, that with great power comes great responsibility. And I love that this is more or less a sports underdog story, no pun intended, as we see Scott Howard's basketball team have to defeat their rivals without the use of his werewolf abilities. Now, if you guys haven't seen Teen Wolf yet, then I definitely recommend that you check this one out. Coming up next is Dog Soldiers from 2002. I actually just watched this film for the first time recently, and I loved it. I thought it was a great movie. It was so good that I replaced another werewolf film that was previously on this list. The cast was great and the story was good. The practical effects and design of the werewolves were very well done. It was also a great isolation story, as most of the film takes place in a cabin in the middle of the woods. It was like Predator meets Alien meets Night of the Living Dead, all crammed into a movie about werewolves. And while it sounds convoluted, it all blended very well. The camera movements were a little fast-paced, but I liked it because it gave a sense of what the characters were going through, having to constantly watch their backs or be on guard as the werewolves can strike within literally any part of the house. Guys, if you have not seen it yet, this is one that you definitely need to check out. So coming up next on this list is Silver Bullet from 1985. This one is based off a story by Stephen King, and what I like about it is not only is it a decent werewolf story, but it also has a murder mystery aspect to the film, as you spend a little bit of time throughout the film trying to deduce who the werewolf is. And now, being completely honest, I didn't care for how early they revealed who the werewolf really is. I wish they could have maybe drawn that out a little longer, because it gives you a pretty decent clue as to who the werewolf is before they officially reveal it, and I wish that they would have just kept us guessing. But otherwise, it's a good werewolf story. The design of the werewolf was pretty good. So if you like Stephen King and you like werewolves, then for sure check this one out if you haven't already. So coming up next, we have The Wolfman from 2010. Now, this film has received quite a bit of mixed criticism, but I personally really liked it. It's a great reimagining of the original film. The design of the werewolves was great and shows how truly brutal and violent and monstrous they are. The cinematography was great. I love how the film just looks very gloomy and dark through most of the film. Now, I wasn't really a fan of the werewolf transformations themselves, except for the one at the asylum. The cast had great chemistry. Benicio del Toro played a great werewolf, and Anthony Hopkins did very well as the antagonist. Now again, this film has received some mixed reviews over the years, but I personally really enjoyed the movie, and I think it's a great werewolf story and a very serviceable adaptation to the original film from the 40s. And not only was this film good in my opinion, the novelization to the film I thought was just fantastic. I actually read and reviewed that one on this channel a few years ago. If you happen to find it at some point, I do recommend watching the film and then reading the novelization and comparing and contrasting the two. All right, guys, we're almost done. Coming up next, we have The Howling from 1981. This one was also based off a book, and I like the whole concept of a secret society of werewolves, and I really sympathize with the main character, Karen, as she just faced one tragedy after another in this film, whether having to encounter a psychopathic serial killer, and then she's sent to this colony where she encounters a group of werewolves in an area where she's already supposed to feel safe and get treatment. And not only that, she ended up becoming a werewolf herself during a news broadcast trying to prove their existence to the world. Now, the designs of the werewolves were great, and this also was a film that consisted of one of the more iconic werewolf transformation scenes in cinema history. Alright guys, so last but definitely not least on this list is An American Werewolf in London. Guys, need I say more? This is by far one of the greatest werewolf stories and werewolf films in cinema history. Now, I confess that out of all the films on my list, this is the one that terrified me. All of the werewolf jump scares are well timed and just brutally terrifying. The film is also a dark comedy to basically every sense of the word because, again, the humor can get pretty dark, especially the scene that takes place at the adult movie theater near the end where David Kessler is interacting with all of his victims that he killed the night before as a werewolf, or just when he interacts with his deceased friend Jack. Now, on that note, the makeup and the effects were just outstanding. Rick Baker's iconic werewolf transformation scene just deserves all of the praise that it's received over the past few decades. And I also like the new takes that it does on the lore surrounding werewolves, where they can interact with the ghosts of the victims of the werewolf, and the victims can't move on into the afterlife until all of the werewolves are eliminated. I don't know, it just creates more tragedy for the victims. Now, whether you've seen this movie or not, if you have to watch one werewolf movie this Halloween, definitely go with this one. And there you have it, guys. That is my top 10 favorite werewolf films of all time. Guys, this was such a fun video to make, and I have to confess it was very hard to make this one because there's just so many great werewolf films out there. So I'm probably going to have to make a part 2 to this to list some more favorite werewolf films of mine. So again, guys, you may or may not have seen your favorite werewolf film in this list, but that doesn't mean I didn't like it. This is just my personal favorite list. And again, I'd be very interested to know what your top 10 werewolf films of all times are, so be sure to post them down in the comments below. But guys, thanks so much for checking out this video. I hope that you enjoyed it. And if you did, be sure to hit that like button and be sure to subscribe to my channel if you're new and you're enjoying my content. Guys, thank you all again so much. Happy Halloween.